Sandwich Generation Survival Guide with your hosts, Candace Dellacona and Jodi Argentino.
Hi, Candace. Long time no talk, see, etc.
Both, I think, right, Jodi? We've
Right.
both been sort of busy with
Right.
various things.
I think falling directly into the sandwich generation purview. So I'm excited to get to today's topic, which is our episode number 6, aging in place.
That's
Which
right.
is what I feel like I'm doing behind my desk every day. But what does
I
it
would say
really mean?
likewise. I would say likewise, right? So this is a topic that's certainly more firmly, I guess, in my wheelhouse. And you and I were sort of talking about one of these sort of topics related, having aging parents. And I had some care issues to deal with in my own family. And it really sort of brought back to light the importance of talking about how one helps their aging parents when they need care. And I think that what we found, Jodi, right, is that people don't know what the universe is until they get there. And oftentimes it's very stressful and there's not a lot of information that's readily available. So this is our opportunity to talk about what's available for our aging parents and sort of how to get there so they have a little bit more orientation when the time comes.
Yeah. And I will say, Candace, I think it extends so much further beyond parents, because you and I both have had the experience where we have had or have elderly aunts, uncles, relatives that don't have any other children of their own. So we end up jumping into that role and being both the advisors and the kid and everything else. So I think this is super important, even if it's not for your parent directly, but to those other people in your life that you end up being the caregivers for.
You're exactly right. And so for our listeners, if they haven't heard, go back to episode 4, where we have some amazing people from the SAGE organization to help advocate for our elderly LGBTQ loved ones. And as Jodi points out, and rightfully so, caring for aging loved ones don't have to be parents. So let's make sure that whomever we love who are in that position, that we can advocate for them and make sure that we know what their options are. So, as people age, Jodi, oftentimes the goal is to keep people aging in place. And what that term means, it's kind of come to fruition in the last 10 or so years, is how do we keep our aging loved ones in the place where they are comfortable, their home, if you will, not necessarily a home, but the place that they identify as being a safe place for them, so that regardless of their physical limitations or their mental capacity limitations, that their needs are met and that they're safe, right? So that's really what aging in place refers to.
And that's such an interesting concept to me because, as I'm approaching 50, I'm of the mindset, I'm like, put me somewhere where I can get my 3 squares a day, other than prison, where I can get my 3 squares a day. I have some entertainment. There's always someone to have dinner with, there's activities built in.
Yeah.
So I'm maybe the bougie version, right? But that's where my brain goes. I'm like, hell, I don't want to stay home.
Yeah.
I want the activities to come to me.
Yeah.
So but you're right in that most people don't feel like that. Most people are like, I don't want to leave my space. And I had that with my aunt. She's like, no, this is my space. This is my home. And I'm like, but it's too much to take care of.
Yeah.
So how do we take care of it and them?
Well, I think what you're saying, though, is not as uncommon as you think. I think that people have an idea of how they're going to feel when that actually comes to fruition, and they may not actually feel that way. Talking about bringing the activities to you and the people to you and the meals to you, I think what you're bringing up in a way is socialization and feeling connected and keeping busy and having purpose and enjoying life. So the first option that you're sort of alluding to without saying is assisted living. And a lot of people say, well, what about assisted living, right? So assisted living is almost like an apartment situation where, as you point out, your 3 meals a day will be covered, or somebody cooks for you and, provides you with your own coffee bar and snacks and that sort of thing. An assisted living facility, generally you get your own apartment, or you could share and have a roommate, almost like a dorm situation for our kids entering into university. So the assisted living setting is relatively new in the United States.
Really?
It came out of a need for the fact that many people in the United States don't have intergenerational families, or it's certainly less common than it was 50 years ago, and absolutely less common than in other countries.
That's so interesting, particularly because we're talking about being the sandwich generation, or we're talking about intergenerational relationships. And
yeah.
But you're right. Even when I talk about intergenerational families in like family law, it is always more common in other cultures than in the US. We're sort of like, okay, everyone's on their own. And in other countries, people just automatically have all of their people in like one space.
Well, that's exactly right. And the point of our podcast, right, is that all of these intergenerational issues exist. What makes it even more complicated and why we created this survival guide is because oftentimes we're not in the same space.
Yeah.
We're responsible for the caregiving of all these different people, and they're not even in the same space.
Or state.
Or state, right.
Right.
And so, the need for an assisted living type option sort of grew from that, where there was an inability for a person to stay in the home that they have called home for however long, whether it's their whole lives or a good portion of their lives, and they needed to move on to a living environment that kept them safe, that made sure that they had healthy, good, nutritious meals, that if they had difficulty remembering things like taking medication, that there were professionals in place to make sure that all of those needs were met, all the while bringing the activities, right? So if you go to some assisted living facilities here in New York City or on Long Island, where I live, they are beautiful. They have unbelievable accommodations. There are happy hours, there are activities, there are trips. And it really can be the answer to what many people want for that socialization. The trick, though, with assisted living is that it costs money.
Yeah. How do we pay for that? That's
yeah. So generally speaking, assisted living facilities are what we call private pay, meaning you have to pay for the cost of assisted living. I would say the average cost of an assisted living facility in this area in New York City is well over $10,000 a month. The suburbs might be slightly less.
I would say around here, probably around 7,500 in like in the metro area.
Yeah.
Down south, a little bit less, but also it depends on what the facility looks like and what 5-star chef is in the kitchen.
Exactly. And so, you can find assisted living facilities that fall within your budget. And one of the guests we'll eventually have on our podcast will be a senior housing specialist that can help guide us through that process. But, for a general overview, I'll tell you that, for the most part, you can find an assisted living facility that is quote unquote reasonably priced, particularly if you're somebody who has a pension or your parent or loved one has a pension, plus Social Security can really take the sting of the cost out. The other option that many people are fortunate enough to have is long-term care insurance. And if you have long-term care insurance, that can also pick up a portion of the cost of your room and board and residency at an assisted living facility. So an assisted living facility really is your housing, right? It's your housing and your assistance with activities of daily living. Activities of daily living is really a term of art in the elder care space or the aging space. We call them ADLs for short. ADLs are eating, bathing, cooking, cleaning, transporting, those sorts of things, the things that you need to do to stay independent in your space. So if you need a little help with those ADLs, an assisted living might be a great place for you because
there's like add-on, like a la carte services, right?
Right. And, to that point, there are add-ons and there are packages in these assisted living facilities where they actually grade you to say, well, this person only needs, a little bit of assistance and this person maybe needs a little bit more. And the cost is then based on the level of care that one might need to be able to stay there. So it can get pretty pricey. So I think that's really important for people to understand that it's not covered by Medicare. It is private pay. There are a very small number of assisted living facilities, very small, that accept Medicaid as payment for your residence at an assisted living facility. And just for our listeners, we'll go back and talk about Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is what everyone receives at age 65. Everybody receives care, but not everybody receives aid. So Medicaid is what you have to apply for.
There was like a light bulb, like, thank you for that care and aid, because I've never heard that. And I get so many questions about them and even I get them confused sometimes. So that's so great.
Yeah. So Medicare is the insurance socialized medicine that we all receive at age 65. It was created in 1967, I believe, by an act of Congress. And what it is basically is generally retirement age. People stop working and most employers don't continue paying for healthcare. So our federal government kicks in its share to pay for Medicare for people who are over 65, namely retirees. Some people need more care in addition to Medicare, and so they apply for Medicaid, but you have to qualify. You have to be financially eligible, and there are ways to do that, which we'll get to, and we're going to touch on that a little bit. But in general, assisted living facilities do not accept Medicaid as a form of payment. As I said, there are some exceptions. Maybe we can put some resources out there, Jodi, on our Facebook page to be available for people. But that's really what the long and the short of assisted living facilities are. It's important to note that you can age out of an assisted living facility. There are circumstances where you cannot stay. And when I say age out, it's not really based on age, it's based on your ability to stay there. Because
like you just exceed the amount of care that they have available.
That's right. And so, many assisted living facilities have certain licenses that require that you are able to mobilize yourself a certain number of steps in order to be a resident there. And, a lot of families say, well, why? This is such a great place, but they have help. And, what you have to think of is, God forbid there's a fire in an assisted living facility, they have to have enough staff to get everybody out safely.
Right.
If somebody has a fall, we have to make sure that they're tended to immediately. So being able to mobilize a good amount is really one of the requirements of an assisted living facility. So it's got to be the right placement.
So that's if we have the ability, the finances, the
That's
desire
right.
to go into a different environment.
Yes.
But I know you really want to talk about the aging in place, not in a different space. So
that's right. So I am someone who I should say, I am someone who would want to remain in my own home as I age. I think that there could be a lot of comfort found there. And many people believe that to be true. Being surrounded by your neighbors or your neighborhood or your home and being comfortable with your surroundings is certainly something that can give an aging loved one a lot of solace, right? When things can be quite difficult. So the aging in place model is when one is more limited in their capacity or their physical ability, but yet they're going to remain in their own home still. And a lot of people say, well, how's that possible? Mom or dad, they're not, or the loved one, they can't remember to take their medicine, or they're not, cooking really good and nutritious food for themselves, or maybe they're leaving the stove on. And so there are concerns about danger and safety within one's home. And so for these people who want to stay home, who don't want the bingo and the activities and the happy hour, they can remain at home by having care come to them. And the care that comes to them is similar to the care that one would receive in an assisted living facility. It's assistance with activities of daily living. The ADLs are back, right? So eating, bathing, dressing, cooking, cleaning, those types of things. And what that means is a person comes into your home to provide you with that assistance. It is not a nurse. It is not skilled care. It is what we call unskilled care. And often the care is provided by licensed practical aides and assistants who are licensed by the local state and can provide assistance care. They cannot administer medication, for example, but they can certainly remind you to take your medication and put it next to you and keep.
Wow.
Yes.
That must be an interesting line to experience, right? Where you're like, okay, here it is. I'm putting it on the table in front of you, but I can't give it to you.
Correct. It really is. And it's very tricky for a lot of families to straddle that line. And, so that care that comes into your house, it's often administered by home care attendants and personal care aides. You can obtain one of these people or retain one of these people, hire one of these people in a number of ways. You can go through an agency, which is obviously, in my opinion, the safest way to go. And the reason why, of course, is because agencies are licensed. They make sure that the people that they're sending into the home of your loved one is licensed. They know what the laws are with respect to the type of care they're allowed to provide, and they have somewhat of a training, and they have oversight. So these agencies that provide, a family with an aide that can come in and take care of your loved one will then supervise that care being provided. And the care, again, are things that keep the aging loved one in an independent state, right? So making sure that their sheets are clean and that their dishes are done and that they're having food prepared that brings them comfort, whether that's like a great Italian meal or something from the Caribbean. It can be prepared in a way that the senior feels comfortable and feels at home in her own home. The cost of this care, right? That's where really it comes in to sort of a crossroads where families say, my gosh, it's expensive. And it is true. It is expensive. We're talking $20 to $35 an hour for this care. And so,
which isn't so much when you think about it from the caregiver's standpoint, right? Like it's the same rate as babysitting.
It is. And it's also, just as important, right? Because when you have a vulnerable child, you want to make sure that the adult that you've hired to take care of them is going to be kind to them, is going to, feed them and make sure that they're, in a safe place and a clean place. And likewise, when you're hiring, someone to take care of your elderly loved one, they may not have the mental capacity to advocate for themselves.
Right. And so it sounds like, oh, yes, that's a lot of money, but not really if you put it in that sort of context.
It's true, and we can say not really, it's not a lot of money, except if you don't have it, right?
Right.
Because then it's like, what do you do? And so that's really where we get into the Medicaid discussion a bit. And we're really fortunate in New York State, for our New York listeners, that we have a program in New York State that will assist in paying for that type of home care through the Medicaid program. Again, not Medicare, Medicaid. Jodi, you live in New Jersey. And unfortunately, I'm not licensed in New Jersey, but I can tell you anecdotally that the program that exists in New Jersey for home care Medicaid is definitely not as robust as it is in New York. So the information that I'm going to impart today is specifically related to New York. And so with that being said, there are people that can't afford home care, but they can apply for Medicaid, and Medicaid will pick up the cost of that home care, but you have to qualify for it.
Right, because you have to have no other assets or like very little other assets, because they want you to do what we call a spend down, right? And spend down a certain amount in order to qualify for Medicaid.
Yeah, so the spending down concept isn't used all that often. I think that one of the things that is sort of interesting in New York right now is that the law has changed with respect to qualifying for home care Medicaid, and that law that's changed has not been implemented yet. So we're still sort of operating under the old guard, which is really as follows. In New York, there's sort of a public policy movement that really wanted New York citizens to be able to qualify for Medicaid at home, as opposed to being forced into a nursing home. And in doing so, they made the rules for home care Medicaid, community Medicaid, as we call it, a little more permissive than the rules for institutional or nursing home Medicaid. Namely, that you could have money in your name in August, and as long as it's transferred out of your name before September 1st, you could qualify, presumably, for community home care Medicaid September 1st.
Wow.
Because there's no penalty for transferring money out of your name. And so that is while it's not the law now, that's the way that the law is playing out now. The law was changed where there is a look back period for transfers that you may have made, and there could be a penalty, but that new law has not yet been implemented in New York.
Okay, but we do have that in New Jersey. As I am licensed here, but I don't do a ton of that. But we do definitely have a 60-month look back on assets and the expenditure of assets. So This is really, even though Medicaid is technically a federal program, like this really differs from state to state.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Jodi. So Medicaid is a federal program, but it's implemented at the state and sometimes the county level. There can be slight differences between counties in the way that the law is implemented. The 60-month look back is universal for institutional care. So that's the look back, at the institutional level. It's going to be 30 months for a look back for community Medicaid in New York once the new law is implemented. But as of now, New Yorkers, you're in a really good position where you can qualify your loved one for home care Medicaid in a very short amount of time. Now, the question becomes, what about millionaires, right? People come to me and they say, well, my mom, dad, they have $5-10 million. So I apply for Medicaid? No. I'm going to be a
problem paying the bill then.
Right. And, the other thing is it's, and I think a lot of elder care attorneys feel this way, is that we want to protect this program. We don't want to abuse the program.
Right.
Because there are people, middle-class people, maybe a little lower than middle class in terms of economic ability. If the Medicaid program didn't exist, they would be forced into a nursing home. So we do want to gatekeep this program for people who actually need it, who would otherwise never be able to stay at home without Medicaid picking up the cost of the care.
Right.
So in doing so, qualifying for Medicaid, it can be done. And it can be done when one has assets by transferring them to a trust or transferring them to a loved one. And, New York has pretty liberal requirements in terms of the amount of assets that one can hold on to. So right now, in fact, New York State just really increased the amount of assets that you can have. So this is what's allowed to remain in your name. You can have $30,000 in your name and tax qualified assets in your name without limitation and still qualify for community Medicaid. So that means that I can have an IRA with $300,000 and I can have a $30,000 bank account and I can still qualify for community Medicaid.
Oh, wait, I thought you said 30,000. You said 300,000 and 30,000?
Yeah. So if your $300,000 is in a tax qualified asset like an IRA or a 401k or a 403b or 457, those assets are not countable in New York as assets. So tax qualified money versus what's in a brokerage account, there's a big difference. And so home care Medicaid really can bridge the gap to allow someone who doesn't have a ton of income, disposable income, to pay that $20 or $30 an hour to a home care attendant, can pay that home care attendant so you can remain at home and age in place and remain independent, or as independent as possible, with that extra level of assistance. And, you can receive up to 24 hours of care. Now, do I see 24 hours of care very often? No, I don't. I think that there's been a chilling effect on the Medicaid program where it is harder to get a large amount of hours. However, certainly that takes the edge off if the government is going to pay for a good portion of the care, right? And it could be enough to allow your loved one to remain at home and age in place in their own surroundings with one-on-one care. Your Medicare doesn't go away. When you go on Medicaid, your Medicare doesn't go away. You still can go to your doctors and your hospitalizations are still paid for. The Medicaid piece just pays for the home care. And in certain circumstances will pay for medical supplies and some prescriptions, and may pay for some extra copays as well that you would otherwise have to shell out of your own pocket, but you don't lose your Medicare. Medicaid comes in as another layer of coverage.
So, all right. So I'm going to ask you a wonky question because I'm, want to do so. So is there a way that someone can qualify either through that or through, I don't know, disability benefits or something to be able to care for their loved one and they get the payment for it?
That's actually a great question. And yes, in New York State, a lot of times there are, as sandwich generation members,
right,
kids, in-laws, neighbors, your core people are providing that care already. So can we have them continue the care and get paid by Medicaid? Yes. If they become certified, and the certification process is not difficult, if they become certified, they can become 1099 employees, if you will, in quotes, of Medicaid, and Medicaid can pay them as a private contractor to provide that care. I even have a relationship with a home care agency who will bring that person on as an employee. and pay that
Well,
loan.
and that makes sense because then it's a person who you trust giving you the care, who for whatever reason in their career life, has the ability to switch for a while or whatever, but only has that ability because they would be getting compensation for it. So it's sort of like a win-win for the family.
You're right. And they are providing a service, right? And
right.
the restriction, I'm sure there are other restrictions, but one of the major restrictions in this situation is spouses can't be paid to take care of spouses, right? Likewise, though, the government doesn't expect a spouse to be a caretaker. So if Medicaid comes in to do an evaluation and say, well, how many hours is this person entitled to? They're not going to look at the spouse and say, hi, how come you're not doing it? There's no expectation that the spouse has to be the caregiver. The spouse can be the advocate. But conversely, the spouse is also not going to get paid by the government to take care of her spouse.
Okay, well, that makes sense.
So children, in-laws, neighbors,
so joint assets
nieces,
and stuff too.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly when you go through the Medicaid application process, there's a lot of severing of assets between what we call the well spouse and the Medicaid spouse.
That I can only imagine how difficult it gets when there's two Medicaid spouses, but that's a different podcast for a different day.
That's true. I'm actually working on a joint application now, and it is a little tricky. So, but I do think that there's a lot of misinformation out there about Medicaid, about the presumption that unless you're very, very impoverished, that you won't qualify. And I encourage people to really get the facts and talk to an elder care attorney in your area, specific to your situation, because even I point out the issue with assets, and you just said, well, you just said that the person could have 300,000 but they can only have 30,000. What's the story with that? If you have assets in an IRA, it's different than if they're not in an IRA. So these little facts are really determinative of the type of care that you can get and whether or not you can qualify. So don't assume that you can't get the care.
So I think that, this sort of goes back to what we were talking about in the last one, which was about prenups and stuff, right? But it was about being prepared.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times from a psychological standpoint, people get stuck and they don't want to plan for what happens when they are not fully able to participate in their life the way they have always participated in their life, right? Like, so there's like a denial of humanity or denial of mortality. And to me, a part of this is just what just happened, just what just happened. You need to think about where your assets are placed so that it affects, you can deal with it appropriately down the road. But practically, there's also those issues, right? So just on a personal level, I have an ongoing dispute with my father because he built a retirement home that has no full bathroom on the first floor and no extra bedroom on the first floor. Everything is up like this enormous, beautiful flight of stairs. And I'm like, well, what are you going to do? Oh, don't worry about that. I'll worry about that when it happens. And I'm going, okay, but if you break your leg, you're not going to build a room, right? Like, let's go with a non-aging concept. I'm like, you can't do it then. You need to prepare for that in advance and think about that. And so I think whether it's financially or practically or familially, I think it's really important to think about these things in advance, rather than just being like, oh, I'll deal with it when it comes, because it doesn't happen like that.
Yeah. And all of those things you mentioned are part of a plan, right? A plan for finances, a plan for the physical place of where you're going to be, and a plan for who's going to be involved in making decisions, right? So with respect to your dad, I think you're bringing up a really good point. And I think a lot of us who have aging loved ones look around at their current living situation and go, how is this going to work? If there's
I'm the one who's going to have to deal with it.
I mean, in New York City, people say that all the time too, when they live in their 1-bedroom apartment, like, where will the aide be? Right. So,
or they live in a walk-up.
Or in a walk-up. A very good point. That has happened a lot. I, took care of an uncle in the village, and he was in a walk-up. Thankfully, it had an elevator, but we didn't use it very often until he became sick. and that apartment did work for him to age in place. But there are so many people that have living situations that will not work to age in place. If there's a stroke, God forbid, or a Parkinson's diagnosis, or something like, as you say, that could be not age related, like a broken leg. What does one do? And, I think it's never too early to talk about a plan, to really talk with your loved ones about, look, what do you want to do? If this ever came to pass, where do you want to be? Do you want to stay in this house? They may say, no, I like this house, but I feel really lonely here.
Right.
Or no, I may want to move closer to my niece and nephew who are in Chicago. And so I think those conversations are so important to have with your aging loved ones, so you know how to advocate for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like we've been talking about in a whole number of these podcasts, talking about the hard issues, that's part of what we have to do, especially if we're caring for, people younger than us, people older than us, and ourselves, having those difficult conversations with ourselves too, and saying, okay, I have to do this. I have to have that. I'm a big procrastinator, right? So I'll be like, yeah, I can't handle that today. I'm going to do it the next day. Yeah. But it's important to have those difficult conversations.
Absolutely. And, mine people for information too, right? And we're going to put some resources out for our listeners, but one of the things that's kind of universal is that we're all going to have gone through something like this at some point in our lives. To your point earlier, Jodi, we all die. Some of us get sick before we die. Some of us don't, but there are so many great resources out there. There are senior housing specialists. There are geriatric care managers who we'll probably have on eventually, home care agencies that are excellent resources on how to hire the right person and match up the right person to take care of your beloved, maybe vulnerable senior loved one. So really sort of seek out those resources. And then back to, which we've talked about before, self-care, your own support. It's stressful being a caregiver. It's stressful having those conversations. So check in with yourself as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This is awesome. I love when I learn something on our podcast that I didn't know before. And I'm like, oh, wait, this is a genuine question. What is actually happening here? So that's awesome. Thank you so much. All right. So I think we're good for today, and we will see everyone, or hear, listen, talk to everyone
next time.
next month.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone.